Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Jan Roller, and I am president of the club. While improving student performance is the main objective for all those involved in education, teachers and administrators are facing tremendous challenges with budget shortfalls, teacher layoffs, and school closings. In addition to these pressures, it appears we are in an era of reform, healthcare reform, financial regulatory reform, and what some hope is education reform. And in education reform, charter schools, which are publicly financed schools that are independently run and free to experiment in classrooms, have been the rallying cry for education reformers. Measured by achievement on standardized tests, some of the 5,000 charter schools in the country fare no better, and some even worse, than public schools. But it is the stunning success of a number, perhaps hundreds, of charter schools, some of which are here in Cleveland, that has energized many about the ability to narrow the achievement gap between poor minority and white students. The most fervent call the school choice movement the new civil rights campaign. With all these issues before us, we are especially honored to have as our speaker today one of the foremost experts on education in the country, Frederick M. Hess. Since 2002, he has been the Director of Education Policy Studies and resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He is a prolific author of scholarly journal articles and influential books on education, such as Education Unbound, Common Sense School Reform, Revolution at the Margins, and Spinning Wheels. Mr. Hess serves as executive editor of Education Next and has an Education Week blog called Rick Hess Straight Up. He is also a research associate at the Harvard University Program on Education Policy and Governance, and he is the editor of several other publications on education policy. Mr. Hess is a former teacher himself. After obtaining his master's in teaching and curriculum at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, he became a social studies teacher in Louisiana for 2 years. He then went on to teach in the fields of public policy and education at a number of universities, such as Harvard, the University of Virginia, Georgetown, Rice, Northeastern, and the University of Pennsylvania. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the podium Frederick Hess.
Thanks so much for that generous welcome. It also became clear to me that I can't actually keep a job, which is one of those things. I tend to approach these issues as a former teacher. Because of that, well, let me back up a sec. I got into teaching. I got to admit, I'm about the only person I've ever known out of the nation's 3.4 million teachers who didn't get into teaching out of a sense that I was going to promote social justice or do right by kids. I got into teaching because I actually just thought it was interesting and good, fun work. And I think that tended to give me always, back when I was in classrooms and even now, a slightly different perspective on how do we think about these challenges. I think if you approach anything as a moral crusade, as a crusade for social justice, it becomes a question of how do we fix the world now, today. There's a moral urgency implicit. For better or worse, that's not the way I tend to think about things. I tend to think about how do I build schools in which I would want to teach or in which I would want to learn? How do we create a system where more of those schools will be possible to serve more of our kids? And for my money, I think you wind up sometimes ultimately at the end of the day in the same place, but you get there by very different routes, depending on how you approach this question. So, as was mentioned, I only taught in Baton Rouge for 2 years. I'd intended to stay longer. There were all the usual litany of things that made it less attractive. I had friends who, 24 months into their jobs out of college, were getting promoted and getting new responsibilities, and that wasn't in my future. But the thing that most drove me crazy was the Picayune stuff. I was supposed to start the third advanced placement economics program in the state of Louisiana. This was back in 1990, 91. First year, it would have required the school secretary reshuffling classrooms and marking up the new assignments on the chalkboard. And they decided this was just disproportionate hassle to be able to offer advanced placement economics. The next year, because of the way we ran scheduling, by the time we had 40-odd kids sign up that they actually wanted to take AP Economics, and the school ascertained that they were eligible for it, we'd already created the teaching schedule. And my load was filled up. And I said, well, I was 23 years old. I didn't much care. I said, I'll teach from my study hall because I get restless anyway and I just cause trouble. And they said, can't do that. It's not the way we do it. It's not the collective bargaining agreement. This is Louisiana. They said, this is just not the way we do things. This is actually what drove me into thinking about policy. What I've never understood is why we can talk so easily about how important education is, about how mission-driven it is, but then accept that teachers and school leaders and reformers and administrators are supposed to accept as the price of doing business Kafkaesque, small-minded, frustrating, bureaucratic routine. It doesn't make any sense to me. And that's actually where I tend to start at these questions. And I think it's directly relevant in a time like today when the fiscal crunch means that states and districts across the country simply don't have as much to work with as they'd like. This means we need to revisit the way we do business. And for me, I think we need to revisit the way we do business by starting to ask, why do we do it the way we do? This, as I said, this takes me to a slightly different place than some of my good friends, and particularly in two ways. One, I'm less inclined to see villains than some of my friends. Anybody in this room who's read my stuff knows that I can be meaner than anybody in this business. I like accountability not because it helps us identify and help teachers, but because it lets us get rid of bad ones. I like charters and vouchers in part because they create competition. And real competition requires taking money away from folks who aren't doing as well and giving it to folks who are doing better. We don't actually do that very often across the country when we talk about competition. So it's not that I'm not a mean guy. Don't get me wrong. But I do find some of the stylized, over-the-top accounts some of my friends in the teacher unions and the rest sometimes get in the way. We forget that union leaders are responding to an environment. They're taking care of their members. They're doing a job that they were elected to do. And sometimes, rather than think about how do we change the conditions in which they're working, how do we change what their members want so that they will naturally follow along, we spend a lot of time screaming epithets about what bad people they are. And I just go back to my time in Baton Rouge. I don't think the people who frustrated me were bad people. I think they were people who wanted to do the right thing, but they were people who had been socialized and brought into and stuck in a particular kind of system. And I think that system was not about solving problems. I think that system was about making sure that we didn't break rules. So I think the answer to this is not to vilify one's opponents, but to understand why they're doing what they're doing and change the world so that they will do what we happen to think, what I happen to think is the right thing. Okay. Now, so I'm suggesting that schools are stuck. Let me give you an example. A good friend of mine is a woman named Michelle Rhee, who's chancellor of the schools in Washington, D.C. You might have seen her. She's drawn a fair bit of attention because she can be controversial. But one of the less controversial things Michelle tried to do is actually most revealing. A couple of years ago, she decided that one of the problems with D.C.'s high-poverty schools was a lack of parental engagement. And her team sat down and said, all right, how do we start creating conditions that are going to foster engagement? They said, here's a brainstorm. One thing we could do is we could get parents actual information on how their kids are doing in school in time for it to be useful. Because at the time, and it might still be the case today for the most part, at the time it took 7 business days to be able to tell a parent whether their child was attending or absent. And in a system like DCPS, where you've got lots of kids from difficult family circumstances, that's a real problem. So they said, well, what's holding us up? Well, it turned out that it took 7 business days because a teacher would take attendance by taking the sticky, putting it on the form, which they would hang on their door. Somebody from the principal's office would come around later in the day, collect all of those manila envelopes, take them to Central, wait for somebody to come from the Central Administrative Office. They would take those over. They would get hand punched in over time, have to be double-checked, and then be uploaded by the IT people, and this took 7 business days.